Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and I'm here today with Blake Faulkner, and we're going to be talking about critical theory. Blake, do you want to introduce yourself to us?
Sure, yeah. I am a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill in the communication program, and I'm in the last stages, done all the coursework, and just trying to finish the book, basically. Get all of my people into one room or onto one screen so that I can defend the book and finish the degree. So that's where I'm at right now, and I study rhetoric in particular. I'm trained in classical and contemporary rhetorical theory, but also do a lot of reading. I've been trained in this discipline of communication, is very much invested in a lot of critical theory, contemporary philosophy, what used to be called continental philosophy, and that kind of tradition is where I'm often looking for tools and concepts. So before this, I was largely not in a contemporary thought environment. I mostly read people that wrote several hundred years ago or more. I have a religion background, and then I also had a classical rhetoric background. So the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, that we're doing today is, I'm somewhat familiar with it, but I really cherish the opportunity to sort of dig a little deeper.
Yeah, and this is so interesting because I'm coming from a philosophy background, and I mostly studied ancient philosophy. Socrates is my favorite, and I didn't realize this, but maybe we are studying traditions that were in conversation with each other really a long time ago with the sophists and Socrates. So I'm wondering
Definitely.
if the conversation today is anything like it was then, but maybe that's another conversation. But
that is always, actually, I think most people try not to have that conversation because most people who read people like Horkheimer are not familiar with anybody in ancient context. So
yeah,
I think we could definitely make some of those links. But the more enlightenment we get, the more they'll want to be independent and rational and
yes.
forget about all those old guys.
No. Okay, here's a question. Am I right in thinking you have some great books background or interest in the great books? Or
Yes.
I feel like that's how we met, through mutual friends.
Yes. My undergraduate program was a great books program.
Okay.
And I was converted hook, line, and sinker after that to that. And I actually just got done taking a great books class, specifically about the educational philosophy of great books and classical liberal arts with Dr. Richard Gamble at Hillsdale College.
Oh, excellent. That's exciting. Okay, so I think one of the things we've been kind of talking about on Facebook is the distinction between analytical and continental. But I think one thing that I've noticed in reading in both traditions is that you can't be in those traditions without also knowing about the conversation that has gone on in the history of ideas. And I noticed that in studying critical theory, these thinkers are really interacting with some of those great books. And I am reading this as if it's part of that tradition. And it helps me to think in broader categories that way, that this is a bigger conversation that's going on. It's not just this tradition versus that tradition. It's a bigger tradition.
Oh, I agree totally. There's a habit, I think, in Enlightenment circles sometimes to act like they are the beginning of real philosophy or something. But there is no enlightenment without the people that enlightenment is responding to.
Exactly.
Which inevitably links you back to medieval and ancient Greek and Roman thinkers.
Exactly. So we read this. Oh, I lost the title now. We read
Traditional and Critical Theory.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Traditional and Critical Theory by Max Horkheimer, and we've come up with some questions to guide a discussion. We can depart from those questions if we want to. But the first one I think we should probably go with is what is theory first. How does Horkheimer talk about it? What is theory?
Yeah, he's definitely trying to contrast himself with what he calls traditional theory, which we immediately have to be, because of our background, on guard. Because when I think traditional, I do not think what Horkheimer thinks of.
I don't either.
When he says traditional, he means more or less the scientific inheritance from the Enlightenment. He means modern. He means positivist, logical positivist. He means a very sort of exclusive notion of knowledge that develops very much in reaction against ancient and medieval forms of reason.
Yeah. So I see him, and I don't know. I see him finding theory originating with Descartes, and it's in philosophy and mathematics, and then it kind of goes out to the natural sciences, and then to the social sciences, and then history. And so there's this theory. Now we could apply it to all aspects of, I'm going to say, the natural world and humans within the natural world. But I was a little bit surprised to see theory beginning with Descartes. I was thinking Aristotle probably does some theory, but maybe not in this way.
Horkheimer's not too worried about the Greek theoria, which would mean sight or some sort of vision. He's not really thinking about that at all. Because, as this essay makes, I think, a consistent emphasis is, he's very concerned with historical development. He's concerned with what's dominant in a particular period. And even in the postscript and in the preface that you've looked at as well, he's very much like, oh, I would have changed this whole essay now if I wrote it today. And he's only, it's not that, it's during his own lifetime.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he's trying to be cutting edge when he talks about theory. And so to him, that means, no older than Descartes, really. He thinks that people since Descartes have dominated the intellectual scene, and I don't think he's wrong about that at his time.
Yeah.
And especially in the American context, which he became important in when he left Europe, that is the dominant tradition of thought in the academy at that time.
Yeah.
So I think that's what he's responding to, is he wants to say what everyone thinks theory is not what I think theory is.
Yeah, good. What does he think theory is? I think this is maybe one of the most interesting aspects of this essay, and maybe it is cutting edge. I think it's new. I don't know if it's his alone or if it's the Frankfurt schools, but I do think there's something interesting here and new.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, you have a hard time just, I think anybody would have a hard time distinguishing Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School. He's one of the superstars of the Frankfurt School. And so it might be worthwhile to just say a word about what the Frankfurt School is doing at this time. And there's still one prominent member of that school who's still alive, Jürgen Habermas, who is related to Horkheimer in a lot of ways in terms of his ideas. So they're still out there. This is by no means a gone philosophy at all. But Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno and even Walter Benjamin and several other thinkers during this time essentially are they're very influenced by Karl Marx, but they are aware that Karl Marx was very wrong in very key areas.
Yeah.
In particular, Marx thought that capitalism would eventually collapse and that there were these sort of home-brewed revolutions going on during his time that would eventually bring about a better state of being. And most of them completely fail.
Right.
And are snuffed out by their governments or simply have no two legs to stand on. They don't really get off the ground in a meaningful way, with the possible exception of the Soviet Union. So what a lot of and these Frankfurt School thinkers are no fans of the Soviet Union particularly. So what these thinkers are trying to do is say, well, we don't really want to give up on our Marxism. We still think Marx is very right about a lot of his diagnoses, about the problems in society, about especially his idea of base and superstructure and ideology. You see that turns up in this essay several times. They definitely agree with Marx's core terms in a lot of ways, but they want to broaden Marxism outside of just focusing on the economy, what gets called vulgar Marxism. And they want to say, you know what, we should borrow from other ideas to fill in the gaps that Marx had. And so I think that's really what he's trying to do. They're trying to reach out to Hegel. They're trying to reach out to Kant. They're trying to reach out to sociologists like Durkheim, phenomenologists like Husserl. They're just trying to find tools to advance the Marxist project, but to give it a different spin than they're essentially responding to the failure of what they think is a kind of failure of Marxism.
Right. I find it interesting.
That's a good snapshot.
I think you're right. And I think there's one more piece that is part of the critical theory, and that is that the one doing the theorizing has to, this is maybe the critical part, realize their social location while they're doing the theorizing. And I think this might be where there's a bit of activism here that wasn't in previous theories. You recognize the social conditions, and it seems like it's the intellectual, recognizes the social conditions, recognizes the sources of oppression, and realizes means for liberating those oppressed groups. And it does seem like it's not just economic now. And that's, he leaves it open, it seems, about what groups are being oppressed. But I think that's also being expanded, the oppressed classes.
Yeah, I think he wants to broaden the scope of, he takes it for granted that people are oppressed. He doesn't, he's not even arguing that. He's more or less just laying out what critical theorists accept and what it means and how it's different from Descartes. So Cartesians and even Kantians are very invested in a distinction more or less everybody knows, even today, is the distinction between subject and object.
Right.
And they lean in so heavily on that often what ends up happening is the privileging of the objective and the subjugation of the subjective.
Yeah.
The relegation of everything inside your head and all of your squishy emotions, all of your religious superstitions, all these things that aren't really very reliable, and and reason will get us out of all that. The Frankfurt School wants to say it's not that simple.
Yeah.
I think I think what Horkheimer wants to say is, and he says this several times, I want to say on, where is it? For subject and object, I have down here. Yeah, on page 224 is where I have down. He really specifically takes on this distinction where he wants to say, yeah, on the bottom of 223 and on to 224, he says, critical theory is neither deeply rooted in totalitarian propaganda nor detached like the liberalist intelligentsia. So he wants to say it's not that we're totally subjective, which would be the deeply rooted, and he thinks that has a political connection to, well, he's probably thinking of fascism. But he also says we're not totally detached either. We don't have this objective point of view either, which is what every average American academic would think for him at that time. That, I can set all my interesting parts of myself aside.
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't like this distinction. And so I think he's trying to make it untenable and say we need a holistic view of what he calls the social totality, which would include the subject and the object.
Yeah, no, I think that's
related.
that's good. That's a good piece to highlight. I think he talks about a web of social connections.
Yeah, relations. Yeah.
You social relations, you can't escape that. So I think that's true. I think there's something true to that. We're not completely objective and we're not completely subjective. There is the reality of social connections. Excuse me. Is this something new, do you think?
Is it new? That's always the question. Everybody wants to be new. Or
is it a unique contribution, would you say?
I would say it is certainly unusual for his time period.
Okay.
Is he the first person to ever say this distinction has limitations? I don't think so. I think we could even say Kant might be doing that.
Okay.
A little bit. Does Hegel restrict himself? He uses subject and object vocabulary, but if anybody thinks in a totalistic way, it's Hegel. So is the Frankfurt School the first? Is Marx? I think yes, he is probably among the earliest thinkers to really say, let's use a different vocabulary than this. Okay. So while Hegel might get beyond the limitations, he does not surrender the vocabulary of subject and object.
Okay.
And I think Horkheimer is trying to borrow from a Hegelian type of Marxist thinking. There are Hegelian Marxists, and I think he is influenced by that kind of strand. Because he wants to incorporate history into how we talk about society and philosophy. And if you're talking about history, you can't just talk about an individual or a objective viewpoint.
Right.
It's more complicated.
And related to that Hegelian Marxism combo he draws from, he does talk about the dialectic often and history being driven by the dialectic, but do you see examples of that in this essay? I mean, he says it, but I would like, it feels more logically driven than, and maybe that's the dialectic is a kind of logic driving history, but he's kind of like showing this progression of theory developing, and it seems kind of like a logical progression. I don't see an antithesis coming, unless he's the antithesis.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to use the Hegelian idea of contradiction, I think.
Okay.
Which Marx also borrows, which is to say, he wants to say that when we are using our reason, he is committed to some idea of reason.
He is, yes.
He's just not committed at all to what he calls the bourgeois idea of reason.
Right.
This classist notion of individualist objectivity, which he thinks Descartes would be guilty of.
Yeah.
But he is committed to rationality because he thinks, I mean, at the core of what we're looking at with Horkheimer is you have a kind of Enlightenment way of thinking that's trying to respond to another Enlightenment way of thinking.
Yeah.
I think what you have is in critical theory, Horkheimer's trying to salvage a type of rationality that gives us freedom, which is that is different from the scientific claims to objective freedom that is so common.
Yes.
So I don't think he's really so far away from traditional theory. I think he just thinks people think they're more free than they really are.
I think you're right. And I see him talking about reason in kind of a, I don't know if you call it Enlightenment way, but the way you ordinarily understand reason. But he also seems to say, because we are such products of the natural and the social, which aren't rational, those forces are not necessarily rational either. There may be something that's working out according to some progression of history, but individuals may be subject to forces they don't even know about. And I think that's what we're seeing today in this institutionalized racism discussion, I think. Absolutely. There are forces we don't know about that you could be a rational being and still not know about those forces.
Absolutely. I think the term systemic that we use all the time now to talk systemic racism,
Yeah.
systemic injustice, I think that's Horkheimer was thinking in those terms
Yeah.
without that term.
Yes, I see it all throughout this essay.
Yeah, when he says social totality, historical activity, contradiction, to go back, and I think it is derived from Hegel. Hegel absolutely refuses to make hard distinctions between things. He connects everything, and
Yeah.
Horkheimer is going to do that too, as Marx wants to do. He does not want to pretend that we can isolate ourselves as academics. And that's really the key thing he wants to say about critical theory is we are self-aware that we are a product of our society and not alienated or separated from it.
Yeah.
And by doing that, he thinks we can be more productive in how we change systemic injustice and oppression.
I think you're right. And you know what, this is making me think I don't know if you want to call it Enlightenment dichotomy between the individual and the collective. This isn't either, really. I like the word holistic that you used. It does feel collective in a way, but it doesn't. It gives you freedom to think, even if you are within systems, because the critical part is the ability to self-reflect on that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So,
I think, what is it? Page 215 is where I noticed this. He says, let's see here.
yeah, I think I see what you're seeing.
Yeah, at the top of 215, he says, if we take seriously the ideas by which the bourgeoisie explains its own order, free exchange, free competition, harmony of interest, and so on, and if we follow them to their logical conclusion, they manifest their inner contradiction and therewith their real opposition to the bourgeois order. So what I think he's trying to do here is show that the kind of thinking that we have inherited from the Enlightenment at his time, from Descartes and from Kant. Kant's very late Enlightenment, but still,
yeah,
he writes an essay saying, what's Enlightenment? Let's do it. Let's make society better by being the few rational people that want to interrogate our authorities. It's one of the best essays of the Enlightenment, I think. Certainly the most accessible. And you can see a lot of that he would call that a sort of bourgeois naive attitude. But he thinks there's value in going down that road and taking it to its logical extension. If you go down the Enlightenment road, he thinks you're going to figure out that this is untenable.
Yes.
You're going to realize that this is contradictory. And so therefore, you're going to realize there's something outside this individualism. And so then he wants to check it and say, but he doesn't think we should go all the way towards Hegel and just pretend there really isn't an individual. He kind of wants to place himself in between Hegel and Kant, and who's the perfect person to do that is Marx. So I think that's how he's trying to position himself is, yes, not hyper individualistic, but also not totalitarian.
Yes.
Would be the way he might put it. Hegel could feel really totalitarian under certain readings. There's sort of this hive mind of rationality that's eventually going to sort of possess everything. And yet he does think that Hegel is right about historical progression in the sense that now that we've gone down the bourgeois individualist route, we can rise above it.
Yeah. No, that's what I think is what is new about critical theory then. It saw the options, it saw the contradictions of those options, and it's proposing an alternative. And maybe that's why I was struggling with how would analytic philosophy interact with this, because it's totally different. And I think I'm going to go on a tangent, but it is one of our questions. How is it different from others? Good. And I was trained in my BA and my master's program in like a super analytic program. And I'm using those tools to look at this going, I don't have any tools really from that tradition to do anything with this. I almost trained to go, this is nonsense. But I think it's because of the, I don't know what, the positivism and the science, the philosophy married to science and the road that goes down. This is a critique of that.
Absolutely. I think Horkheimer would place a lot of that analytic discourse in the same universe as positivism.
Yeah.
Because, and fundamentally, I would say, if we had to point to one thing that distinguishes thinkers like Horkheimer and much more broadly what used to be called continental, the categories don't hold up anymore because people are better at reading each other now.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, amongst these thinkers, if there was one thing I had to say that distinguishes analytic and continental thinkers, it would be that it would be the way that they write.
Yes.
Analytic thinkers are writing in very much a tradition that's directly connected to the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition of logic.
Yes.
There are many permutations. It gets more technical. It gets more mathematical, even computerized. Symbolic logic is the extreme of that. And coding would be the extreme of that today, too. That's the method or the means by which analytic thinkers try to break down sentences and propositions and ideas in a systematic fashion.
Yeah.
Critical theorists are reacting to that mode of thought, and continentals in general, especially Hegel. Kant is kind of on the edge there, where he is doing some of that systematism, but he also has a kind of free flow way of writing in some of his other works. Like What is Enlightenment? So he's kind of on the edge. That's why I think both traditions borrow from Kant. Because he shares but both of those styles. But Hegel, good luck isolating syllogisms in Hegel. Like, it's ridiculous.
I think that's why I never read Hegel in that program. They were laughing at Hegel, like, what is this?
I mean, it's one of the most the most famous understatements in philosophy is that Hegel is difficult to read.
Yeah.
He develops a completely different vocabulary, and that gets picked up by lots of other people, including Marx, including Nietzsche, including even people like later the Foucault and Derrida and Lacan. These people are indebted to a different way of arguing, a different way of thinking that is trying to be much more I don't know how to distinguish it because they're not uniform.
No, they aren't. But
maybe essayist would be a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Like Montaigne, for example, in the older sense of an essay where they're trying to make an attempt as opposed to make a systematic set of propositions that all fit together and don't contradict each other.
Yes.
They're not committed to avoiding contradiction like I think analytics are often.
I think you're right. So the method of writing, and one is, well, I kind of think of it this way too sometimes, and it's just in my mind because of where I am. But the analytic side of things tends to work better with science and technology and logic, of course, logic. But the continental seems to be more doing critique in a different way. So I've been thinking about critique too, and the history of critique, and that's rhetoric is in there too, I think. But I think the continentals took that to the next level, critique to the next level. And I think maybe some of them in the, I don't know if you want to call them postmodern, Foucault, Derrida, maybe they were going down this road and there was no place for activism or changing the world with that kind of critique. So I think maybe that's another place critical theory is filling in a gap that was in that tradition. Hey, yeah, that's really great. Let's critique. But what about fixing the oppression? How do we do that with that method you're using?
Yes, and I think I am probably too quick to point out a parallel between ancient rhetoric and contemporary critical theory. But yeah, it's not difficult to see how Plato and Aristotle are very systematic in their thinking,
Yeah.
but ancient rhetoricians like Isocrates, for example, or Cicero. I mean, the historical dismissal of Cicero is a great testament
Wow.
to what in many ways is the same attitude that analytics can have towards critical theorists, where they're difficult to read, they're not making sense, so we're not going to take them seriously. That's sort
Yeah.
of, that's a vulgar way. That's not,
Yeah.
again, it's not tenable now, but it definitely in the past has, I think there is a similar dismissal. I think perhaps some ancients would look at critical theorists today and say these are sophists.
I've been going that way. I'm
Yeah.
calling the different critiques.
And the word postmodern has served that purpose for a lot
Yeah.
of discourse.
I'm calling them the new sophists, and I don't mean it in a bad way. I just mean this seems to be what happens.
Oh yeah,
when
sophism gets a derogatory tone, but it doesn't have to.
Yeah, I work with a lot of communications majors, and they love the sophists, and they are like, "Hey, Kelly," and I'm like, "I like them. I appreciate them. I'm not knocking
Well,
them."
I mean, their name just means wise people. That's all it means. I explain it this way, that sophists originally were just people that had expertise somehow, and they were teachers for ancient Greeks. But they get a derogatory name in the same way that lawyers today is a very derogatory term, but no one thinks that lawyers are useless. Like, we need lawyers,
right?
Even though a lot of them have a bad name. And I think that's how sophists are too. There are plenty of bad ones, but they have a proper role.
Well, while we're on this topic, let me ask you. My dissertation was on Socrates' dialogue, or Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, where Socrates is arguing about the sophists, and I claim that he is arguing against skepticism there, that he thinks we can know, and I am wondering, is that something that is true about the sophists we can't really know, and is that true about what we're seeing in some of these critiques today? We really can't have knowledge of, let's say, objective reality, like Plato or Socrates may have thought.
This is a mixed bag for me, because especially when we get to Horkheimer.
Yeah.
I do believe there is a very similar distinction in Horkheimer between appearances and reality as there is in Plato.
Yeah.
I mean, the famous Marxist distinction, which he uses, between base and superstructure, between ideology and reality, that I don't know it's difficult for me to say that isn't a similar way of thinking.
Yeah.
Right. There's some special method for Plato. The method is dialectic. It's a form of rationality, for lack of a better word, but it also is kind of this collective super historical process that everybody's involved in, per the Phaedrus, that sort of rolls across time through different bodies and reincarnation in a way. Reason is a big part of the historical process for Plato, and Horkheimer it is too. It's just a different kind of rationality. And they do think we have access to the base, to reality. They think it's difficult. They think it's wrapped up. I could see Max Horkheimer and Plato having a similar discussion about the cave. I don't see them as totally different from each other. But yes, there is a kind of skepticism of the status quo in Horkheimer. But at the same time, I would say he would call that a skepticism of appearances.
Right.
And
that's a good application. Yeah.
Plato is happy to be skeptical of appearances.
Yeah.
He wants us to very severely question how things appear, and do they look good? Do they look sophisticated?
Right.
Or are they really good?
Now, what about skepticism of metaphysics? Because I think since Kant, that's pretty much a given. He calls it idealism. And I read another essay in this series where he's talking about metaphysics, and it's almost like either you've got materialism or idealism. And I'm like, no, those aren't the only categories, but okay, let's roll with it. So things like the human soul or God, or I don't know, whatever else you put in the category of non-physical realities, he doesn't seem to want to talk about that. And are they skeptical of those things?
I think I'm trying to remember where the page was where he specifically used metaphysics, but I think his point, if I'm not mistaken, was not that he wanted to engage in metaphysics and say that they're wrong. I think it was more the place that metaphysics gets you to has the same historical result as bourgeois liberal philosophy, and also as nationalistic,
he does say that.
hive mind, maybe Hegelian thinking as well. For him, it was, and this is how I was taught the Frankfurt School at the same time that I was taught the American pragmatists.
Yes.
And I was taught that on purpose because I do think there is a similarity in the sense that to them, if at the end of the day there isn't a material difference to what your philosophy produces, what does it matter?
Yeah.
You know, to them, there is a very pragmatic, that's the materialism for them. A difference that makes no difference isn't a difference.
Right.
And so, I think it's kind of a sidelining of metaphysics more so than it is an engagement of it or a negation of it.
Okay. I have been studying Nietzsche and some Heidegger, and I know
they do attack metaphysics.
Yes. And so
for sure.
I actually found the Frankfurt School through studying Nietzsche's influence in America, and they brought a version, an interpretation of Nietzsche with them, and it was a kind of I guess negative, pessimistic, and I wonder how much of his thinking is taken in by these critical theorists as well. I haven't seen it very much, but I have it on my radar.
No, I do too. My dissertation, as yours as well, is very indebted to Nietzsche and interacts with Nietzsche in a lot of ways. And so I was also looking out for that. And while I can see similarities, and I know, just as a historical fact, that the Frankfurt School read Nietzsche.
Yeah.
I don't see it a lot in this particular essay.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't think he's trying to go that route. And I think, honestly, if we want to go that route, I do have a comparison that I think is apt. Late in the essay, there is a very key treatment of emancipation and of oppression that I think Nietzsche would be very incompatible with.
Right. Okay.
So the idea of a master and a slave, I don't know if you want to go into that vocabulary now.
Sure, why not?
Okay. So Hegel talks about the distinction between a master and a slave, and it's not a literal term.
Right.
He's not talking about literal socioeconomic slaves or masters necessarily, so much as he's talking about a way of thinking and a way of being, a form of consciousness, a form of historical participation.
Okay.
So he introduces that. This is probably the most influential part of Hegel, is this little 5-page section in his Phenomenology of Spirit about master and slave, and he never talks about it again. But it's the section that most of the 19th and 20th century really took off with, including Nietzsche. Okay. And also, I think, Marx.
Okay.
So let me see. Where did I put? It's on page 241. So I don't think this is an engagement with Nietzsche. Oh, there is no 241. What am I thinking of? Maybe 231.
No, are you sure? There's a 241.
Or am I not looking at it right? I may not be getting the pages
Maybe
right.
not.
I think it's 231. Where is 241? Oh no, there is a 241.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm thinking. This is what happens when I do paper. Gotta physically keep track of everything. Okay, yeah. Page 241. He talks about. Let me see here. Yeah, that top paragraph, second sentence. He says, "To strive for a state of affairs in which there will be no exploitation or oppression, in which an all-embracing subject, namely self-aware mankind, exists, and in which it is possible to speak of a unified theoretical creation and a thinking that transcends individuals," Kant and Descartes.
Yeah.
"To strive for all this is not yet to bring it to pass. The transmission of the critical theory," he always calls it the critical theory, which sounds weird to our ears, I think. The transmission of the critical theory in its strictest possible form is, of course, a condition of its historical success. But the transmission will not take place via solidly established practice and fixed ways of acting, but via concern for social transformation. Such a concern will necessarily be aroused ever anew by prevailing injustice. But it must be shaped and guided by the theory itself, and in turn react upon the theory. So what do I think he's doing here? He has a very clear view that reason will, his form of he calls it critical theory, he doesn't call it reason.
Yeah.
But it is his form of reason.
Right.
He's using reason largely to talk about the bad guys for him.
Yeah.
He wants to say this reason will emancipate us from oppression and exploitation. It's just going to take a while. And we're not probably going to see it right now. We're in the early stages of it. And it's going to take historical work.
Exactly. And I think, okay, first we were talking about the master-slave narrative.
Yes.
But
I think this is his view of, this is his version of the Marxist master and slave dichotomy.
And it does seem like he's talking about the future. And he's talking about how to overcome the prevailing injustice. And I think this may be where, let's say, third generation, fourth generation critical theory starts to become social justice. Is that what we want to call it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he uses words like social totality and societal injustice and things like that are very similar. But yes, it is a notion of the central problem in the world is oppression.
Yeah.
The central problem of the average person is the slave.
Yeah.
And the slave is not necessarily a literal slave, but for Marx, in many ways, it is. Hegel didn't think of the master slave in literal terms. He thought of it in much more idealist and abstract terms. But Marx wants to say, no, really, there are oppressors everywhere. And the slaves need to, the master is capital for Marx.
Yes.
Not the literal strong man, not necessarily even state power with guns. It's capital. It's the capitalist system.
Right.
And that is what needs to be overthrown by its subjects of oppression, which are
right. And so critical theory is, the critical part is being aware, hey, maybe I'm participating in that system while I'm also trying to change that system. Yeah. And it does seem like
you are in the system.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help
no getting out of.
I'm in.
There's maybe a way of thinking outside the system, but never of completely escaping it unless we get to emancipation.
So the intellectual or the person doing the critical theory, he sometimes calls it the savant. I don't know. But
I don't know if that's a critical theory or if that's
that might be the other theory.
Thinker, the savant.
But it does
like the savants are the ones that produce facts, right? Isn't that what he says? Yeah.
It does
Which
seem
I love.
Like the critical theorist is the intellectual, probably in a social location where they can influence others. And you do that through ideas, right? It seems to me. So this is a person that's between ideas and activism.
Yeah,
and that seems like professors.
I think he would want to deny that distinction. He right?
Okay.
He ultimately wants to say theory is practice.
I agree. I agree.
Right?
But I think he does see an evolution, if you want to call it that, a progression of theory becoming critical theory. Like this didn't come from nowhere. It developed as theory was applied more and more to the human condition, to the natural world, and now we are historically at a place where we can critique our own.
I see Kant's "What is Enlightenment" all over this. I mean, I think
that's a good point.
I think Horkheimer's very Kantian in some ways.
Yeah.
He wants to resist his prudy Christian morality. He wants to resist the bourgeois aspects of Kant.
Yeah.
But the essay "What is Enlightenment" is very similar in this sense, that it has a broad notion that we will gradually be able to think better as we do the hard work of reason, but not reason for Horkheimer. It's critical theory.
Right.
So yeah, I think he does believe that it is a developmental process, and we're getting better. He does think we're better now.
Yeah, I think he does.
And he thinks we will be better later. And he says critical theory will necessarily adapt and change.
Right. Yeah. I think you had some other interesting questions that are maybe we should look at. And
sure, we may be sidelining them. That's fine.
No, I really like this, but I want to somehow get from the theory here to what I'm seeing on the streets right now out in the current political scene. But there were some interesting questions about whether, is critical theory inherently conservative or progressive?
No.
I thought that was a really great question because I feel like it's being used by both sides.
Absolutely.
You use the word partisan. It's become partisan. I thought that was a really great description.
Yeah, it's become a very politicized term. It is. I mean, I study a lot of evangelical and traditional Christian discourse as a rhetorician. And so in the past, I would say critical theory is being treated today how evolution was treated in the past, how humanism was treated in the past, how higher criticism was treated in the past. Various different regimes of academia get set up as enemies of the church, and of Christian faith generally. And so I've seen critical theory used in that context a lot. But I've also seen it as something that is inherently progressive and Marxist, even communist, if it's exaggerated too far, and therefore trying to undermine all of society in a negative way. So I think that Horkheimer does have a narrow definition of critical theory.
He does.
He has a Marxist definition, a Kantian definition. He's borrowing from Kant, Marx, and Hegel to create this definition of critical theory. But he does not believe that it is descriptive of most intellectual activity up to that time. Whereas there are broader notions of critical theory that do have a lot of the descriptive potential that critical theory for Max has, but don't have the normative thrust. And I think that broader definition of critical theory is not so easily politicized. So, for example, even if we just stick with these three thinkers, Kant, Hegel, and Marx, or even Nietzsche, widely considered people that are important for what critical theory means, even by Max's standards, you won't find anybody with more conservative ethics than Kant. I mean, he's super individualistic. He will refuse to do anything unless it's on principle. He couldn't care less about utilitarian effects of what you might do. He does support a very bourgeois version of Christian morality. Very classist in a lot of ways. And likewise, you will not find anybody more kind of establishment than Hegel.
Hmm.
There's a famous book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History.
Yes, I know that book.
Which is a neoconservative reading of Hegel that's quite influential.
Yeah.
And so and likewise Nietzsche. Goodness, I couldn't find anybody who's more anti-Marxist than Nietzsche.
Yeah.
He hates even the idea of equality and egalitarian society, and thinks hierarchy is the way it is. So get used to it. You know, like that. I can't. You know, there's no universe in which those thinkers can be incorporated into what we now consider progressive politics. At least not an easy, simplistic way.
Right, not. But okay, I'm going to play the other side. It does seem like it's definitely progressive in the sense that history is progressing and we can sort of influence it. And it seems like this is maybe a tangent, but it's coming up to my thinking right now. It's by our willing it to happen. And that I think could have some ties to Nietzsche. I'm not sure. He didn't mean it that way, but I do think the emphasis on the will and group will is something you see here. And it's about progress, making things better, making the world a better place. And so in that sense, I think it is progressive, but I do think he isn't anywhere near tear it all down, burn it down. In the preface, he has this really great quote warning against doing that. He's saying, you guys, this is like the freest place you can be right now. Don't tear it down, because then
there's a reason that Max Horkheimer fled Germany and Europe and lived in the United States.
Yeah.
He still calls the United States totalitarian or authoritarian.
Yeah.
It's just differently. It does so through culture rather than through overt state apparatus.
Right. And I'm
so
not sure he's wrong about that.
I don't know if he's wrong either. But that, Adorno, for example, is much more negative than Horkheimer. He thinks that American totalitarianism is worse.
Yeah.
Because we don't think it's totalitarian.
Yeah.
Because it's seductive. Because it looks like culture, but it's really fake.
Yeah.
And Horkheimer was worried about that too. He has a couple parts of this essay where he thinks culture's completely disappeared.
Yeah.
So that is a concern of human agency and free will and the ability to do things, but not necessarily in just an individualistic way, but also in a sort of collective historical agency. And yes, I think you could easily, to do the rhetorical thing, Kant is very progressive.
Yeah.
He believes in historical progress of rationality over time. You know, if the state and authority get out of the way, we'll get better, we'll get smarter, we'll get more reasonable.
Yeah.
Just naturally, we'll get better.
Right.
Hegel, too. The idea of trans-historical progress is very Hegelian. He's not very normative about it. He thinks this is out of our control. There's no agency in Hegel at all, I think, is fair to say. He doesn't care about agency particularly.
Okay, the normative question. Can I ask you,
sure.
The way I don't know the way I see the social justice, I'll just call them people because mostly they're my students. It seems like it is a whole new ethics. And I don't know if it's rooted in critical theory proper, or if it's just a way that it's been developed because there is this perception of oppression and this call to, overcome injustice. It becomes a kind of ethical system or alternative now.
Oh, I don't know if it's a new ethics, but I definitely believe it feels like a new ethics.
Yeah.
They think it's a new ethics.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a Nietzsche thing, and I'm going to say, not to criticize it, but I think he has a very helpful vocabulary for morality.
Yeah, he does.
I think what we're seeing today is another example of moral thinking and really even academic thinking that starts with oppression, that starts with evil, that starts with what's wrong in the world, and then reacts against that and says, if I'm not that, then I'm good.
Oh.
Then I'm virtuous.
Uh-huh.
Then I'm on the side of right. It's a reactive vision of morality.
Okay.
And I think that's what you see in a lot of discourse right now in social justice persons or people advocating for social justice. Right now, they begin with social injustice.
Yes.
They locate systemic racism. They locate, it could be capitalistic oppression. They locate whatever they see, or patriarchy, if it's from a feminist point of view. They locate the base in Marxist terms, and then they say, we need to be looking at this oppression and not be so deceived by all these happy, superficial things that make it look like it's not oppression. And so it may not be direct. In some cases, it's a mixed bag like every political movement.
Yeah.
Are there some people that read critical theorists proper, like we're talking about? I think Horkheimer would want to say it doesn't have to be that neatly drawn historically, right? It's the long influence of critical theory over time has endured. And that has had social effects, and that has influenced people consciously or unconsciously. And we have adopted a mindset of beginning with oppression, whether we happen to have read Horkheimer or not.
Right.
And so I think it may not be a clean connection, but I think it's conceptually valid.
Okay.
That we begin with what's evil, and we work backwards.
Yeah. So we're talking about critical theory, the critical theory, but people who are using that word today seem to be saying something different. I heard you use the word political. Sometimes I see people talking about critical theory as if it's an ideology. Sometimes it looks like an alternative to religious revivalism to some people. I've been talking about it as a philosophy, but as I look at Horkheimer, I don't think it's the same thing. Maybe I just need to do a little more reading.
Yeah, no, I is critical theory a philosophy? For Horkheimer, certainly not. It's not a philosophy that's comparable to other. He doesn't want to compare it, I don't think, to Kantianism, or even to Platonism or something like that. I think it is a commitment to certain core ideas.
Yeah.
Certain historical concrete realities.
Yes.
And then other commitments outside of those, as long as we agree on the reality of oppression, the reality of historical activity, the reality of the social totality, the persistence of ideology, those kinds of commitments are sort of core for Horkheimer. And the refusal to separate intellectual work from those processes.
Right.
If you're committed to that, I think the rest is relative to the moment, relative to what's going on at that time. And that sets the task for emancipation.
I think you're right. So maybe we should think of it as a social scientific project rather than a philosophy. I've been thinking of it as a philosophy because there are elements, but he is really emphasizing theory, the development of the theory, and now what the theory does. And that doesn't seem to be like he's contrasting this theory with positivism, with maybe religion and idealism, but he's not saying this is the alternative. He's just saying
it's different.
It's not that.
Yeah.
It is a different theory.
He thinks it's different and probably better.
Yeah.
Doing better in a sense that it does things the other one doesn't do and probably should.
Yeah.
But I don't think he really uses the word philosophy at all.
No.
And I think that's on purpose.
He does at the beginning, but yeah, I think you're right. He doesn't.
He wants to avoid that older connotation.
Yeah.
And I think I could draw a line or similarity between critical theory and the love of wisdom.
Okay.
I don't know if I could draw a line between critical theory and the idea of philosophy as a systemic answer to all of our questions.
No.
Right?
What if we went back to rhetoric?
Sorry?
What if we went back to rhetoric? What?
I think that would be easy, yeah. But I also want to sort of, rhetoricians often want to break down that distinction between rhetoric and philosophy. You know, basically is what's the connection between thought and life? Rhetoricians always want to connect thought with life. And so does Horkheimer.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And really, philosophy, I think, did too. I think philosophy in many circles tried to connect thinking with life.
Okay.
And insofar as philosophy is a way of life, Horkheimer is doing philosophy.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I just saw an interesting distinction you made between thought and life, which he's definitely focused on. Definitely not thought and being, though, which may be the old school philosophy stuff. He's not doing that. And I'm not sure most people do that after Nietzsche. I mean, unless you're kind of an old school person, but
I agree. The notion of being, of solidity, of fixity, of truth. Horkheimer would use the word truth.
Yeah.
That is, he firmly locates that as a kind of enemy.
Yeah.
Of critical theory.
And I think Nietzsche was bold and saw the future of philosophy. And I think he said, hey, this is a fiction. We need to expose it. And in the future, the philosophers of the future won't make that mistake. Or if they do make that mistake, they will at least know it's a fiction.
Yeah. Nietzsche is a tricky subject. I will go off if we go down this road.
It's okay. Maybe we can have another
No, we should.
With him.
I definitely want to, but I'll leave Horkheimer behind if we do that. But no, I do think that Horkheimer believes we're at a phase where those solid categories are unhelpful.
Yes.
They will not bring about emancipation. They will reinforce the status quo.
Yes, I think you're right. And I don't know if you've read much Richard Rorty, but he likes
I know of him.
He likes to say that basically everyone after Nietzsche is a pragmatist. And I think in a way he's kind of right, insofar as we have kind of put aside that question of thinking about being. And if we put that question aside as philosophically interesting, then thinking about living is what we do. And we don't talk about metaphysics in the old school way anymore. We do talk about this stuff. So I think it's not a philosophy, but I really like what you said about it's thinking about living.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that connects to the sophists.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Philosophy gets interpreted as love of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is a strand of philosophy that recognizes it as love of wisdom, which is something different from knowledge, or mere truth, or intellectual acumen.
Right.
And I think that's you can parse the distinction between rhetoric and philosophy, and when they're enemies that way, and you can also parse that, scientists for Horkheimer are interested in knowledge proper.
Yes.
They're interested in a narrow, isolated, and exclusive, privileged version of truth. And Horkheimer wants to say, yeah, but does that have any real material connection? And if it does have a material connection, is it a good one?
Yes, I think you're right.
he wants to make ethics roll into this question.
Yeah.
Whereas scientists want to abstract ethics out of it.
Yes. You know what? I'm wondering now if we could take, as thinker activists, take these ideas we've been discussing and say, hey, we've divorced thinking about being from thinking about living, and those all work together early on in philosophy. We do epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics, and we shouldn't divorce those things.
No, I mean, the reason people went to Plato or Aristotle or even the Sophists was not just for intellectual funsies.
Right.
They went to those people because they had power, because they were going to be rulers, because they had to defend themselves in a law court and they had no idea how to talk or to think.
Yes.
Because they needed training. The birth of philosophy is intimately connected to actual practice in life.
Yes.
And I think Horkheimer is regretting that. I mean, he's not thinking in ancient terms, but I do think he would sympathize with that link rather than its alienation. He would call it alienation of thought from life.
I think there's something to that. And I just have been making some online videos for my ethics class. And I made a video series on the history of philosophy just to give some context to why we have all these different theories. And I included critical theory because my students they're very much into social justice, and I wanted to include that. And historically, I think I see now better how it fits. And so in that sense, this is a really fruitful conversation for me.
Right. And I think the temptation is the temptation today, I think, is to consider critical theory, whatever we define it as sort of the only people who do connect thought with life.
Yeah.
And that is not true.
Right.
And it is, even Nietzsche wants to do that. If Nietzsche wants to start anywhere, it's with life, and he wants to leave thought behind.
Right.
Like he thinks knowledge is way overrated.
Yep.
So, there are lots of people, and even before Nietzsche, who do want to think of, I mean, is there any sense in which Thomas Aquinas's ethics are not about social justice? I don't think so.
No.
He has a great way of incorporating individual and systemic issues.
Yes.
In his treatment of law. He doesn't call it ethics, he just calls it law.
Yeah.
Different levels of law. So yeah, I think there are lots of thinkers who already have done this kind of thing in different vocabularies. But Horkheimer's doing it with his vocabulary.
Right.
Which is the Marxist vocabulary, but the flawed, he acknowledges, flawed Marxist vocabulary.
Yeah.
And he wants to try and fix it, wants to try and amend it.
Yeah. And I think given the concepts he's using and the tools he's using, it's an interesting theory, let's just say.
Yeah. And I think it's a more flexible theory for Marxists.
Yeah. And you
Marx,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Marx, we should remember, a lot of people don't know this, or at least they don't bring it up. Marx articulated himself in terms of science.
Yes.
He did believe that he had access to this privileged form of knowledge and rationality. It was just different from everybody else's, but he called it science because he wanted to give it legitimacy.
Yeah.
Horkheimer is correcting that.
Yes, I think that's the critical part, is like you weren't sufficiently aware, but now we are. And I think that's good. I think that's a good feature of the critical theory. One of the questions we were going to ask, and I'm kind of pushing it because I don't want to go too long, is you asked this really great question: how ought we to use critical theory? And I was thinking how, and I just thought we use it as a conversation partner. I'm not committed to critical theory. I'm willing to use some tools, but I definitely view Horkheimer as a conversation partner for sure.
Yeah, I am. This is an ethical question as much as it is an academic one. which is why I asked it. It was the last question I asked because it was the hardest one.
Yes.
So I can give it the least amount of treatment. Um,
Nice.
but no, it's important. Important to at least gesture towards an answer. I would say critical theory right now is being used, it's being instrumentalized.
Yeah.
It's being simplified. It's being vilified.
Yeah.
It's being stereotyped.
Yeah.
And if we did that with any other field of thought, any other field of even scientific academia, which critical theory sets itself off kind of against, or at least in contrast to. If we did that with any other field, I don't think anybody would be happy with that.
Right.
Anybody in those, if people started generalizing about theology the way we're generalizing about critical theory,
Yeah.
or started vilifying history the way that we're vilifying critical theory, I think that would be problematic. I think people would not appreciate that. I think it would not be helpful.
Right.
And it would cause issues. So I have an attitude towards critical theory as this is a strand of thought that I do think is broader than what Horkheimer thinks of it as. I think Horkheimer is a good strand of critical theory, an interesting strand of critical theory, a thoughtful strand that's trying to be specific.
Yeah.
To his historical timeline. But I do think that critical theory is bigger than that.
I agree.
Critique, particularly, is bigger than that.
Oh, yeah.
And insofar as critique and critical theory is bigger than that, I think we are obliged to give it in the same way that we give flexibility to the term reason.
Yeah. Agree.
Nobody is allowed to just pretend that reason is the same for every thinker.
Right.
And so I think the same thing needs to be done with critical theory, is that word doesn't mean the same thing to everybody.
Right.
Just like rhetoric didn't. The ancients fought all the time about what rhetoric meant.
Yeah.
And same thing with reason.
Right.
So I think we ought to treat it as a contested term, and therefore as a term that requires a little more work when we use it.
I agree.
That's sort of my starting point, is just a bit of caution.
I agree. And I'm going to be trying to trace from the Frankfurt School to now in my, studies. And I want to see how people take this term and maybe change it or add to it or emphasize different things. Because I do think there has been a transformation since Horkheimer. And it's an interesting transformation. And it may be that critical theory merges with other critiques here and there, like literary criticism or law gets into legal theory. So I think it's an interesting theory, and then people are going to take it and apply it in different disciplines and different areas of thinking. And I'm going to trace that out and see what's going on.
I think that's a worthwhile project, and I think it'll be a messy project.
Oh yeah.
But it'll be worthwhile because you'll find, I think Horkheimer is right that critical theory, like everything, is a part of the social fabric.
Yes, it is.
For good or for ill, effective or not, emancipatory or not, rational or irrational.
Right.
It's built into the social fabric. If it wasn't before, it is now.
Exactly.
And so, yes, I think it's worth a careful treatment. And I think there's plenty of similarities and trajectories between the Frankfurt School and contemporary uses of critical theory. Yeah. In particular, I'm sure you stumbled upon this, but the idea of what we now call systemic, but what those Marxists would have called overdetermination, or they would have called plural causality. In other words, they're moving on from thinking about human activity or even the world in terms of X causes Y causes Z.
Right.
They're moving on from that very strict causal reasoning, and they're trying to say, no, there's a lot of overlapping causes that cause humans to do what they do.
Yeah.
Good luck predicting it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it's a web. I love that. It's a web of interactions, and
It is a web, and I think
Yeah.
it's even observable in scientific contexts too.
Yeah.
The illustration I would use for this would be when you watch a plant grow, or when you help a plant to grow, it's not that the water causes the plant to grow. It's not that the soil causes the plant to grow. It's not that the sunlight causes the plant to grow. They all overlap at the same time.
Yes.
It's an ecosystem.
Right.
And then something happens to not come by and eat the plant as well.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a lot of how these Marxists and critical theory today, when we talk about systemic injustice, I think people who know what that means understand that it isn't as simple as having one bad guy
Right.
to blame for the
Right.
whole problem. We're in a weird contradiction, I think Horkheimer would say, where we
Yeah.
are very committed to the idea of the system,
Yeah.
of the impersonal injustice, but we very much want to still locate that in a particular place and say,
Yeah.
that's my oppressor, that's my cause,
Right.
that I can blame my suffering.
Right.
I think that's what a lot of our guilt and shame and blame vocabulary is. It's a emotional vocabulary of causation.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And that's happening at exactly the same time and by the same people who believe in systemic injustice that isn't really compatible with that older idea of singular causation.
Yeah.
I think
Wow.
that's where we're at.
Interesting times. Do we have the tools to actually make the world a better place, whatever that means? Can we actually get rid of injustice with these tools?
Well, that's a big question, but
Maybe
yeah,
it's another video, huh?
I do tend to believe, I mean, even Horkheimer's a little aware of this being kind of a utopic vision.
Yeah.
But he does it anyway.
Well, yeah, I think some others I've been reading have been using this utopia as a goal. We may not actually achieve it, but we need to have that as something to move towards. Otherwise, this is hopeless, right?
I agree. I think it's very similar to Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
Plato's never going to say, we're going to get the Republic.
Right.
In fact, he says to the contrary, when you get to the laws, he'll say, no, we're not actually going to do that. We're going to do something different that's more contingent and complicated and maybe second best. But we still need the ideal in order to do that.
Yes.
I think Horkheimer is very similar. We may not get there now. We may not get there later. We might eventually get there. It's important just to have a direction.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a good place to wrap things up. It's the element of hope. I always like to end with that. So, Blake, thank you.
We'll do our Nietzsche recording another time.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if we'll be able to end that way.
No, but maybe. I have a way. I'll tie it together with hope. All right. It's been so great talking to you, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Kelly. Thank you.